The most dangerous thing you can do around a manipulative person isn't to argue with them, it isn't to expose them, it isn't even to walk away. It's to become completely calm. Because the moment you stop reacting, something changes. You stop giving them information. They can no longer see what hurts you. They don't know what scares you. They don't know what will make you defend yourself, chase them, or desperately explain your side. And when they lose access to your reactions, they're forced to reveal something far more valuable than their words: their behavior. If you've ever dealt with someone who constantly provokes you, twists your words, or makes you feel like you have to defend yourself, stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why your calmness can reveal more about a person than any confrontation ever could. And if you want more Stoic lessons that help you master your emotions instead of being mastered by them, subscribe now. Think about the last time someone accused you of something you didn't do. Your instinct was probably to explain. You wanted to clear your name. You wanted them to understand. You wanted to prove that their version of you was wrong. But what if you didn't? What if you simply paused? No angry paragraph, no desperate defense, no attempt to convince them. Just silence. Watch what happens next. A person acting in good faith will usually seek clarity. They may ask questions, they may listen, they may try to understand. But someone looking for control may become uncomfortable because the script has suddenly changed. They expected resistance, they expected emotion, they expected you to reveal exactly where they had power. Now they have nothing, so they push harder. They provoke you again, change the accusation, demand an explanation, become offended by your calmness. And sometimes they reveal far more through that reaction than they ever would have admitted voluntarily. This is why silence isn't simply the absence of words. Silence removes the distraction. It gives you a chance to stop listening to what someone claims and start watching what they actually do. Marcus Aurelius understood that your first responsibility is to govern your own mind. You don't have to answer every insult. You don't have to defend yourself against every opinion. And you don't have to surrender your peace simply because someone is trying to disturb it. But here's what most people miss. Silence isn't powerful because it makes other people uncomfortable. It's powerful because it makes their behavior visible. And once you learn to recognize what people do when they can no longer control your reaction, you'll start seeing conflict, rejection, disrespect, and even relationships differently. Because sometimes the person standing in front of you isn't hiding their intentions. You're just talking too much to notice them. The moment you stop reacting, you don't just become calmer, you change the rules of the interaction. People are used to getting feedback from you. They say something cruel and you become defensive. They pull away and you chase. They criticize you and you explain. They provoke you and you become angry. Your reaction tells them exactly where they can reach you. But take that reaction away and suddenly something changes. They no longer know if they still have influence over you. And that uncertainty can reveal more than 100 questions ever could. Imagine someone deliberately says something hurtful because they know you'll defend yourself. Maybe they question your character. Maybe they suddenly become cold. Maybe they accuse you of not caring enough. Your old instinct might be to fix everything immediately. You explain, you reassure, you send another message, you try to prove that you care. And without realizing it, you've turned their behavior into your responsibility. But what happens when you stop? Not because you're playing games, not because you want revenge, but because you've decided that you don't have to participate in every emotional battle someone invites you into. Now their behavior belongs to them again. Some people will calm down and communicate honestly. That's valuable information. Others will escalate. They'll push harder, create another accusation, or search for a different emotional trigger. That's valuable information too. And some will disappear the moment they realize you're no longer giving them the reaction they wanted. That can hurt, but it can also free you. Epictetus taught that other people's actions and opinions are outside your control, while your own judgments and responses belong to you. The moment you understand that, you stop measuring your strength by how perfectly you can control someone else's behavior. You measure it by how little their behavior can control yours. This is where silence becomes emotional discipline. You're not trying to make someone feel your absence, you're learning to stop making their presence necessary for your peace. And there's a deeper psychological reason this works. When you're emotionally triggered, you don't observe clearly. Anger makes you defend. Fear makes you overthink. Attachment makes you excuse behavior you would never tolerate from someone else. But calmness creates distance, and distance gives you something emotion cannot: information. So the next time someone tries to pull you into a reaction, don't immediately ask, "What should I say?" Ask a more powerful question. What are they going to do when I give them nothing to react against? Because sometimes the answer to that question tells you everything. Silence doesn't make people reveal who they are. It removes the noise that was helping them hide it. And that's a difference most people never understand. When you keep explaining, questioning, defending, forgiving, and filling every uncomfortable silence, you become part of the performance. You're so focused on their words that you stop noticing the pattern behind them. But when you become quiet, the performance has less to work with. Now watch carefully. A person who genuinely cares about you may notice your silence and try to understand it. Someone who depends on your attention may become anxious. Someone who needs control may become irritated. And someone who only valued what you provided may simply disappear. The silence didn't create these reactions. It exposed what was already underneath them. That's why you should never judge someone's character only when everything is going their way. Anyone can be kind when you're agreeing with them. Anyone can be respectful when you're giving them what they want. The real test begins when you calmly say no, when you stop chasing, when you establish a boundary, when you refuse to keep forgiving the same behavior for the 10th time. That's when the mirror appears. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself to focus on his own character rather than becoming consumed by the actions of others. And that gives you a powerful advantage. You don't need to force people to reveal themselves. You simply need enough discipline to stop interrupting the process. Don't fill every silence because you're uncomfortable. Don't send another message because you're afraid of what their silence means. And don't create explanations for behavior you haven't observed long enough to understand. Watch. Because a sentence can be rehearsed, an apology can be rehearsed, a promise can be rehearsed, but a pattern is much harder to fake. Once you stop judging people by isolated moments and start watching what they repeatedly do, your questions change. You stop asking, "What do they say they want?" You start asking, "What does their behavior consistently move toward?" That question is far more revealing, because people can control their words, but sooner or later their patterns begin speaking for them. And when you become quiet enough to notice those patterns, you may discover something uncomfortable. The truth was never hidden. You were simply too emotionally involved to see it. One of the fastest ways to understand someone isn't to give them everything they want. It's to calmly stop giving them what they use to control you. Then watch. Because people can control their words when they know what you want to hear. They can promise respect, they can apologize, they can tell you they care. But when the situation stops going their way, maintaining the mask becomes much harder. Imagine someone repeatedly disrespects you, then waits for you to confront them. You explain yourself, they apologize, you forgive them, and eventually the same behavior returns. The problem wasn't that you failed to communicate clearly enough. The problem was that the behavior never changed. So this time, you don't create a dramatic confrontation. You simply step back. No angry message, no threat, no long explanation. You become less available to the behavior. And now their next move becomes information. Do they reflect? Do they take responsibility? Do they change? Or do they become angry because your attention is no longer guaranteed? That's where the difference becomes visible. A person who values you will care about the damage their behavior caused. A person who values control will care about losing access to you. One moves toward accountability, the other moves toward pressure. They may suddenly become extremely nice. They may remind you of everything they've ever done for you. They may accuse you of changing. They may make you feel guilty for having boundaries. And if you're not paying attention, you might mistake their discomfort for genuine regret. Seneca understood that your peace should not be placed in the hands of other people's behavior. You cannot force someone to respect you. You cannot force honesty into someone. And you cannot control what they do when you stop giving them what they want. But you can control your access, your attention, and your response. That is where your power begins. And here's the uncomfortable truth. You don't always discover someone's intentions by asking what they want. Sometimes you discover them by watching what they do when they don't get it. Watch how they react when you say no. Watch how they react when you stop chasing. Watch how they react when you refuse to argue. Watch how they react when your emotions are no longer available for them to pull on. Because anyone can behave well while they're getting their way. Character becomes visible when they aren't. And once you learn to watch that moment instead of fearing it, you stop needing people to tell you who they are. You simply let their behavior answer the question. The biggest mistake you can make when someone becomes distant, confusing, or inconsistent is trying to force an answer out of them. You send another message, you ask what happened, you replay the conversation, you analyze every word, you search for a reason that will finally make the uncertainty disappear. And the more confused you become, the harder you chase clarity. But here's the Stoic truth most people learn too late. You don't always need an explanation to recognize a pattern. Epictetus built much of his philosophy around one brutal distinction. Some things belong to you, and some things never will. Their intentions don't belong to you. Their honesty doesn't belong to you. Their loyalty doesn't belong to you. Their opinion of you doesn't belong to you. But your attention does. Your response does. And your decision about who deserves access to you does. So you don't have to interrogate someone until they finally admit what their behavior has already shown you. If their words say they care, but their actions repeatedly leave you feeling disposable, don't immediately invent an excuse for the contradiction. Observe. If someone promises change every time you pull away but returns to the same behavior once you're comfortable again, observe. If someone respects your boundaries only when they're afraid of losing you, but ignores them once they feel secure, observe. You don't need to label them a villain. You don't need to assume their intentions are evil. You simply need to stop ignoring the evidence. And this is where Stoicism protects you from another dangerous habit. Mind reading. There's a difference between saying, "They're definitely trying to manipulate me," and saying, "Every time I set a reasonable boundary, they try to make me feel guilty." The first is an assumption. The second is an observation. And when you learn to separate facts from stories, you become much harder to manipulate. Marcus Aurelius understood that your responsibility is to govern your own character, not control the character of everyone around you. So stop chasing people for answers they keep refusing to give. Let time reveal consistency. Let distance reveal priorities. Let boundaries reveal respect. Let silence reveal what happens when you stop doing all the emotional work. And here's the freedom in that. You don't have to expose someone to protect yourself from them. You only have to become honest about what their behavior keeps showing you. Because when you stop chasing explanations, you finally create enough quiet to hear the answer that's been there all along. Not in their promises, in their patterns. But now we have to confront a truth that can completely change the way you understand silence. Silence is not always strength. Sometimes silence is wisdom. Sometimes it's discipline. And sometimes it's fear pretending to be peace. This is where many people misunderstand Stoicism. They hear "control your emotions" and think it means never speak, never confront, never show pain, and never react. That isn't strength, that's suppression. Imagine someone repeatedly crosses a boundary you never communicate. You stay quiet because you want to appear unbothered. They keep doing it. You become more frustrated. You tell yourself you're being stoic, but inside, resentment is growing. That's not emotional control. That's emotional avoidance. A stoic doesn't become silent because he's afraid of confrontation. He becomes silent long enough to decide whether confrontation is actually necessary. And there's a massive difference. If someone insults you and you stay quiet because responding would only feed their ego, that's strength. If you stay quiet because you're terrified of standing up for yourself, that's fear. If someone repeatedly disrespects you and you calmly create distance, that's self-respect. If you remain in the same situation because you're afraid of being alone, that's attachment. The outside behavior may look identical, but internally they're completely different. And that's why intention matters more than appearance. You don't need to perform indifference. You don't need to pretend you don't care. And you don't need to ignore someone just to make them chase you. That's not Stoicism. That's another form of emotional dependence. Epictetus taught that we should govern our judgments and responses. Sometimes the right response is silence. Sometimes it's a boundary. Sometimes it's a difficult conversation. And sometimes it's walking away. The question isn't, how can I stay silent so they realize my value? That's still making your peace dependent on their reaction. Ask something more powerful. What response allows me to remain in control of myself? That question changes everything. Because real strength isn't the ability to stay quiet forever. It's the ability to choose your response without being dragged around by anger, fear, pride, or attachment. Once you understand that, silence stops being a tactic. You don't use it to punish. You don't use it to manipulate. You don't use it to make someone desperate for your attention. You use it when silence serves your values. And when speaking serves your values, you speak. Because Stoicism was never about becoming emotionless. It was about becoming your own master. Here's where everything we've discussed becomes practical. You don't need to become a mind reader. You don't need to interrogate people about their intentions. And you don't need to create some dramatic test to expose them. There's a much simpler approach. Stop interfering with the evidence. When someone triggers you, pause before responding. Not for 3 days to make them chase you. Not to look powerful. Pause long enough for the first emotional wave to pass. Because your first reaction is often trying to protect your ego, not discover the truth. Then observe. Don't ask what you think their behavior means. Ask what you can actually see. Did they take responsibility? Did they respect your boundary? Did they try to understand? Did their behavior change? Or did they immediately turn the situation back onto you? This matters because your mind loves creating stories when information is incomplete. They don't care about me. They're jealous. They're trying to manipulate me. Maybe. But you don't need to guess. Give reality time to provide evidence. And don't judge someone by one isolated moment. One mistake doesn't necessarily reveal character. One bad day doesn't define a person. But repeated behavior is different. If every boundary produces guilt, if every disagreement becomes punishment, if every mistake somehow becomes your fault, if every time you stop chasing, they suddenly become interested again, at some point, you're no longer dealing with confusion, you're dealing with a pattern. And once you've seen the pattern, there's one final step most people avoid. Choose. You may communicate, you may forgive, you may create distance, you may walk away. But whatever you choose, choose it deliberately. This is where the Stoic principle of control becomes real. You cannot control what another person reveals. You cannot control whether they become honest. You cannot control whether they change. But you can control whether you continue giving the same behavior unlimited access to your life. That's the real silence test. You aren't testing them. You're testing your own ability to remain calm long enough to see clearly. And something changes when you practice this. You stop needing immediate answers. You stop reacting to every emotional trigger. You stop chasing people for explanations. You start trusting observed behavior more than anxious imagination. And eventually, you realize something powerful. You don't need everyone to reveal their intentions. You only need enough clarity to decide what you will tolerate. That is when silence stops being a weapon against other people and becomes a discipline that protects you. And eventually, you reach a point where something changes inside you. You stop needing to know what everyone secretly thinks about you. You stop analyzing every delayed message. You stop replaying conversations at midnight, searching for the sentence you should have said differently. You stop asking why someone suddenly changed, not because you've figured everyone out, but because you've stopped needing everyone to make sense before you can have peace. That is the highest form of silence. In the beginning, you may use silence to observe people. You want to know who is genuine, who is manipulating you, who respects you, and who only wants access to your attention. But if you stay on this path long enough, you discover something even more powerful. You don't need to expose anyone. If someone's behavior repeatedly disrespects you, you don't need them to admit it before you step away. If someone breaks your trust again and again, you don't need a confession explaining why. If someone only values you when you're useful, you don't need to force them to say it. Their behavior has already given you enough information. Marcus Aurelius understood that your life becomes lighter when you stop allowing other people's behavior to become the center of your inner world. You can let someone misunderstand you, you can let someone leave, you can let them tell a story about you that isn't true, and you can remain still. That doesn't mean becoming cold, it means becoming free. You stop chasing closure from the person who created the confusion. You stop demanding an apology before allowing yourself to heal. You stop trying to win arguments that no longer matter, and most importantly, you stop using silence as a strategy to make people come back. Because if your silence is secretly saying, "I hope they notice my absence," you're still emotionally attached to their reaction. Real freedom sounds different. They can do whatever they choose. I will still choose who I become. That is Stoic strength. And if this video has made you look at silence differently, subscribe to the channel. We're building practical Stoic lessons that help you become calmer, stronger, and harder to control, one principle at a time. Because the ultimate power of silence was never making someone regret losing you. It was reaching the point where you no longer need them to regret it. You don't need revenge. You don't need recognition. You don't need the final word. You simply observe. You understand. You choose. And then you move forward, because when your peace no longer depends on what another person says, thinks, reveals, or does, their intentions can no longer control your life. And that is the moment silence stops being a tactic. It becomes freedom.